they have not arrived. So we do, thanks to the wonderful Virginia, have exactly 10 copies. So we thought we'd have a little fun with this. If you pre-purchase a book, you'll help Virginia get onto the Calgary Herald bestseller list. And then shortly after the presentation is done and everyone's had a chance to purchase, we'll do a draw for these 10 copies. Everybody else, we literally hope to have the books in a couple of days, and we'll give you a call when they're ready to be picked up. If you'd like Virginia to sign yours to you, we can take all of that information and get it signed before it's ready for you to be picked up. So now that that business is out of the way, I'd love to introduce the wonderful Virginia Nemetz. We are here to celebrate her very first novel, The Redemption of Anais. Apparently you can pronounce the name in very different ways. I've read this book. I was lucky enough to be one of Virginia's readers when it was in manuscript form, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I really do recommend it as a great read for book clubs. Virginia, in fact, is a member of the book club here at Owl's Nest. We've got some members there in the back. If you want to learn more about the book, there is a series of YouTube videos about the book and trauma on YouTube that you're welcome to have a look at. And this event will be part of the very last video of the series. Virginia and her husband Brad have been longtime customers of the store, and we're always so thrilled when we're able to launch another one of her books. I'd love everyone to give a round of applause to Virginia.
Thank you all for coming. I was thinking there would be nobody here tonight with the snow, the weather, and the way Calgarians like to hibernate when this sort of thing happens. Pretend it didn't happen. Anyway, I'm not going to actually do the reading. Perry Mack is going to do the reading, because as most of you know, I hate reading my own work. So he will be doing that after I just give you a little background about the book. Can everyone hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay. A little background. I started this book when I was doing my PhD. I guess you could say started it because, you know, it's in your head. That's how it gets started. My PhD work was on trauma and the work with journals to alleviate trauma. So people who had had a serious abuse and would then write about it in journals often felt much, much better about their whole process and healed a lot faster. So in my research, I came across Neen, who I had read many years ago. She died in 1976. And for those of us who have always loved her work, she is a diarist second to none. Her work is beautiful. And her life was very wild. I attribute that to the fact that she was terribly abused and traumatized early in life, and she made the most of it, to say the least. You know, she's been fictionalized in things like Henry and June, the movie, and these wild things, which these are just small fractions of her life. The main part of her life, which I hoped by calling this book The Redemption of Anais, was to redeem her in the eyes of the world, in the sense that she was really a strong, amazing woman, and she's now in the pantheon of feminist writers everywhere. She was blacklisted for a while, but she's on the list again. Depends on how people are thinking about things. Anyway, so when I was doing my research, I checked in at UCLA, where they had all 150 original volumes of her work. So I read every single word in handwriting, nearly went blind. And so she doesn't let a lot of this into her public journals, but the stuff she kept in the journals that are at the archives is actually amazing stuff. And then I had the idea one day to phone her second husband, and he answered the phone, and he and I spent many, many hours together talking about his beloved Anais. He was already in his mid-80s, she never divorced her first husband, so she was actually a bigamist. But that kind of goes along with the idea that she had a dual personality. Truly a dual personality. She was what is now called dissociative identity disorder. So, having said that, a little bit about the story itself without giving it away. She has a mentor, and he realizes that she has two personalities. And he's an agent for spies. So he asks her to join his group. And as he said, she has two personalities, which makes her double agent. Right? So she'll never get caught. One side of her doesn't know what the other side's doing. But anyway, it's a great device for a literary device. So without further ado, Perry is going to read a selection that he chose, and he says it gives you a little idea of what's going on. So hopefully this, because you can't read the end of a novel. This is not a good idea, right? So it's near the beginning of a book, and hopefully you'll get a little taste for it. Okay. All right. So without further ado, Perry Mack.
Yeah, I'm going to sit down. If everybody is okay with that, I hope you can hear me. I'll just add a couple more words just to set the stage. I think that is a brilliant introduction. I'll just give you a little bit about the setting of the book. And you have to imagine most of the book takes place in Paris of the 1920s. And if you imagine the world of Paris of the 1920s, France has just gone through the horrible trauma of the First World War. So not only has the protagonist suffered phenomenal trauma, the whole country has suffered trauma. And Paris as a city and the inhabitants of Paris are trying to recover the world that they thought they had before 1914, and it's very difficult. And it's into that world that we spend time with our character. But that's not the only place that you are in this book, and I think I'm not giving anything away if I tell you that in short periods of time you're with the character in Paris, in New York, in Havana. There's trips to Zurich involved here. It's a very expansive book in terms of time and space. I think that's fair. And the world that she lives in is a very interesting world. If you think of Paris at the time, you've got some interesting people writing books at the time, including Joyce and D.H. Lawrence and Ernest Hemingway, and some historical characters interact with our character in this world that she's living in. And there are two parts to her world that I need to explain before I read this next passage. The character of Anais, or Anais, is setting up a very stylish place in this Paris. She's establishing a gallery on a houseboat in Paris. And so she's living a life that's very exotic, very erotic, and very much integrated into the cultural scene at the time. That's one world. The other world, her other personality, Angela, is married to a banker, which is a little different than the world of Joyce and Hemingway and D.H. Lawrence. And in that life, Angela lives in a fashionable suburb of Paris, a short train ride away from the center of town, and she carries on this perfect life as the perfect hostess and the perfect wife. And she's married to a banker named Christophe. When you read the book, nothing is ever quite as it appears to be as you go through the book. Anais isn't who she appears to be. You find out about Angela. The characters that she interacts with always have another aspect that surprises you later. Even the banker becomes interesting. No disrespect to any bankers. And so it's a nice read that way, and you have this world of intrigue layered on this normal, almost 1950s suburban life, but nothing is ever as it appears to be. So the chapter I've chosen is one that sort of introduces or melds a lot of those concepts very quickly at the front end of the book. I've chosen chapter 4 because you're introduced to a lot of that. I think the only other theme is this world that these people are living in, they're trying to reconstruct, is there's shadows looming all around them. Obviously the difficulty of reconstruction, the difficulty of the world coming to peace, the Conference of Versailles going on at part of this, and all of that intrigue, and of course the ominous tone of the rise of fascism is also behind all this. And I think you likely see some more of that as the books go on. So it's a very interesting blend of a lot of things going on that this incredibly interesting person appears to be in the middle of in this book. So I commend it to you. So this is chapter 4, Angela as hostess. And I've got about 10 or 12 minutes to read here to you, and I think it's a good springboard to the rest of the book. Angela's hostess. Anais' heels echoed along the empty street. She had hoped to get home before Christophe, who was returning from Zurich this evening, and expected her to entertain a few of his colleagues. Frequently, he was called to Zurich for bank business, but hopefully, by the time he got home, Camille would have prepared dinner, and a fire would be lit in the living room, along with candles to welcome the damp spring evening. She planned to look striking in an oriental caftan, while he had a drink in front of the fire and told her anecdotes of his week away from the home. She loved it when he was in Paris. He was her friend, her protector, and her devoted husband. She, however, was not Anais when she was home. In her mind, she was Angela. And the closer she got to home, the more she thought like Angela. And the more she acted like Angela, the housewife, and the banker's adored wife. To say that she became Angela and left Anais to walk along the empty street is a poor description of a mental aberration whose parameters had yet to be studied carefully by doctors. The fact remained, however, that Angela had split off a portion of her mind. This rather serious and mostly undetected problem had happened to her during an acute crisis in her life. In effect, she had created another personality. Anais had given Angela her name and apportioned to her a segment of her life that would be forever separated from the traumatized Anais. In that way, it was Anais who protected the person she called Angela. Yet Angela knew nothing of the existence of Anais. So Anais knew all about Angela, though Angela knew nothing about her. As she hurried down Rue Mousson, her cloak, that she had changed into at her pied-à-terre in Saint-Germain, was disturbed by the gusts of the early spring air. She knew she was late for dinner. If she was lucky, their guests would be enjoying an aperitif. How had it come to this, she asked herself, late to her own dinner party, an event she had overlooked, if truth be admitted. The moment the gate closed behind her, she heard footsteps across the street. She had the sense of being followed all the way from the train station, and it wasn't the first time. Here it was, years after the war, and she was still paranoid. Footsteps on the street after dark, in the evening, shadows of alleys, and on a narrow back street sidewalk still resounded with old war fears and premonitions of disaster. No one had returned to old routines. How much longer would it be before the citizens of Paris could breathe normally, let go, and move on? To add to her dismay, Anais had accepted employment as a spy. In these days, truth had become a big issue for Angela as well as Anais. Drops of rain accompanied by a lull in the wind softened the air around her. Rain allowed the evening to dampen her disturbed thoughts. As her walk turned into a glide and her cloak whispered around her, she unlatched the wrought iron gate, glanced through the lighted windows on the first floor. Thank God Camille knew the routine. Angela had told her to organize everything before she had left for the day. Quietly, Anais slipped into the garden, entered the house through the kitchen, and made her way upstairs. Several years ago, Christophe had bought this house in a rundown state. It was only a 10-minute ride from the city and a 10-minute walk to the station, but it put them outside the tensions of Paris. Though everything about the house had seen better days, Angela had felt inspired when she saw the property. The damp and dreary rooms, the outdated kitchen, the overgrown garden, and the neglect that welcomed mice and spiders in from the cold had driven the price well below market value. Now 3 years later, paint and cheerful curtains, a new stove, hours in the garden, and her own Japanese style of elegance had created warmth and serenity. It lured visitors and guests from the city on a regular basis. Christophe loved to entertain in their home, and he loved to showcase his delicate and mysterious wife. His banker friends and colleagues considered it an adventure to take the local train to Lucien and walk the 10 minutes through the pleasant countryside to their destination. They felt as if they had stepped into an impressionist landscape far removed from the realities of work. No one ever came by car. Instead, their metaphorical journey from the center of Paris to Christophe's home gave them a sense of holiday and of ritual. Strange how truth and reality could become so confused. Angela loved to stay at home with walls for boundaries, where life was uncomplicated and the mirrors on the walls reflected nothing more than a view of the room, a face, and makeup applied with care. Christophe said she was sensitive and lovely, and he wanted nothing more than to protect her gentle sensibilities. She loved that about him and felt cherished. Angela looked in the mirror. No one had heard her enter the kitchen or take the stairs to her bedroom. She needed to change, repair her makeup, and put her mind at peace. Her fears on the walk home had occurred more often in the last month. She found herself coming home from the city without any memory of where she'd been. She felt strange. Staring into the mirror did not bring back any memories, although she tried many times. If she did not hurry, Christophe would become upset as he tried to excuse her absence or play the role of host. Her attempts to copy her hospitality in the past, his attempts to copy her hospitality in the past, were less than satisfactory. His demeanor spoke of a state banker or a conservative and unimaginative businessman. He counted on her to maintain his role as a valuable bank employee while making his home a fascinating place to come to dinner. The sound of someone following her, her lateness, and her lack of recall frightened her, but being Christophe's wife helped dispel fears. The role of hostess was something she did well. She was like a sponge that absorbed the talk, the atmosphere, the subtitles, and the shadows. After their dinner parties, she squeezed out all the details she could remember into her diary. Its pages had become a receptacle for insights and intuitive observation. Once she had shared her concerns between its covers, she continued placidly about her duties as a housewife. If there is an art to be in a person, Angela wished to practice that art. Fulfillment as a human being was no small ambition. She believed that the effect she might have on others came only from the person she was inside. Before having an effect on the world, she had to be the kind of person she admired. It was the only way she could be sincere, compassionate, and non-judgmental. When she was with others, she wanted nothing more than to be immersed in their outlook. Dinner parties were more than random get-togethers, more akin to opportunities to touch others with kindness while looking through their eyes to see new perspectives. She pondered as she wrote in her diary whether this attitude had to do with her writer side that sometimes emerged, or her chameleon-like ability to disappear through her relationships. One thing was certain: she loved people and the endless possibility she recognized in them. She saw them and revered what she saw. The talk was unusually subdued when she stepped into the dining room. "Good evening, gentlemen." She felt sighs of relief and a stir of interest that meant that bankers yearned to discuss more than bank, cheque, and deposit slips. These days, their conversation was all about debts and overdrawn accounts. Paris was yet to be repaired properly, while her citizens watched helplessly as money leaked out of the country. It went in the direction of Switzerland, or Panama, or other foreign countries that accepted hidden assents. It was a slippery business, and a single disparaging comment could bring families, could bring jobs tumbling, leave tidy offices in chaos, and find families abandoned to starvation. Just as her presence soothed and calmed the distracted Christophe, it did the same for her guests. As a rule, Christophe shared details of his work with Angela until he felt healed of the day and ready to return to his seemingly insurmountable challenges. His guests reacted in the same way and loved their visits out of the mired city beyond the restrictions of daily habits. Angela wore a kimono, one she had sewn by herself in front of the fire on quiet evenings. The black silk was lined with brilliant reds and oranges, huge chrysanthemums, and delicate green hand-painted stalks. These patterns could only be glimpsed near the collar of the V-necked wrap, the panel of the skirt, and of course, the unwrapping of the Kobe belt. Such vivid details covered the fact that she was naked beneath her costume. Men leaned forward as though they could imagine the slide of heavy silk against her skin. Yes, they thought Christophe was a lucky man. This is a marvelous book, and thank you for asking me to read it.
Thanks, Perry. I hope everybody got that. It's a little complicated, but it's a good read. I want to take this time to do a lot of thank yous. I want to thank Peter, who's behind us. It was actually Peter's conception for the cover of this book. It was done by the publisher, but it was using Peter's idea. I want to thank Jude Dillon for doing the photography on the inside. He's not here this evening, he was sick. And I want to thank all the people who I've already acknowledged in the acknowledgements, people who read early manuscript drafts. So, and aside from that, I have a little anecdote, and that is about the dedication to the book. I've dedicated it to Alice Munro. And years ago, when I was a newbie and just starting to write, I was a student at the Banff School of Writing, and Alice Munro was my teacher. Who would have known, right, in those days? And I was very, very pregnant. I was 29 years old and I was 8 months pregnant, and so I kind of didn't fit in with the regular group. And day before she left that seminar, Alice Munro came up to me, because she used to come up and pat my stomach every day and make sure that, you know, Clea was doing okay. And she said, okay, I have to tell you, she said, you are one of the best writers I've ever come across. But she said, there's a but to this. I don't want you to go home, and when you don't, if you can't write for 2 decades, 3 decades, and nothing's coming to you, she said, don't lose faith. She said, when you do start to write, nothing will have been lost. You will pick up where you left off, and you'll be just happy you took care of this kid, because she's gonna take a lot of time. And she said, and you know, I'm speaking from experience, and I think she had 2 or 3 girls of her own. Anyway, I remembered those words for decades, because that's how long the interval was between my time at the Banff School and finally publishing a first novel. So anyway, thanks to Alice Munro as well. So that's about it.
Did anyone have questions?
Oh, does anyone have questions about the book, about the process of the book, or just to hear yourself talk?
Well, I love to hear myself talk. So I just ask you, it's about a character with 2 personalities.
It is.
Did you think of writing it in the first person with those 2 direct voices, you know, instead of in the third person?
Guess not.
That's all. I have no follow-up. That's all.
just came the way it came. I didn't try to redo it or anything. Just seemed right at the time. Because when you're in one of the characters, you're solely in that character, and then, you know, that was the big issue, was trying to make it clear to people which persona you have just stepped into. I think I've made them quite distinctive, and
Yes.
yes, thank you. So not too confusing. So, any other?
Yeah, just on because I know that you are also a clinical psychologist.
Oh, yeah.
So on a clinical basis, is it correct that in those situations where you have these dual personalities, that one of them does not have an awareness of the other, so one's dominant, the other's always submissive?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
They don't have to be one submissive, or they could be both equal. There were times in her life, and that brings up another thing. I'm almost finished with volume 2. Ta-da! So you have to read volume 1 so that you can get volume 2. But there were times when a third personality used to pop in every once in a while. I try to ignore that because it's not fleshed out much. I don't think she even knew half the time about the third one. But it's always the case that one doesn't know about the other. And there's no telling which one is gonna know about the other, or who's gonna be the one, you know. It's just the luck of the draw, I guess. But in this case, Anais is the strong character. She's the extroverted, artist, exotic one. And the other one is just the opposite. She likes to stay home. So. Anything else? Okay, Julie?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to thank Virginia once again for sharing her work with us, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out for it.
Thank you all for coming, yes,
Yes, thank
especially
you.
on this day. Yeah.
The evening is not over. There's still lots to eat and drink. Please purchase your books. I'm thinking it's about 7:45 now. At 8 o'clock we'll draw as to who gets the lucky copies to take away tonight. Everybody else, you will get a call in the next few days that your copies are here. If we could ask you to fold your chairs and lean them against one of the fixtures, that gives us more room for the socializing. And thank you once again for coming out, and another round of applause for Virginia.